Hi, gang. So it's either appropriate or ironic that we're talking about burnout on day 4, right? So we've got a lot to get through, a lot of great personal stories to share, some science, and so we're going to hit the ground running and really kick this off. So burnout is one of those words which, much like crunch, is talked about with a lot of assumed understanding on the part of other people. And so it's one thing to be a little bit, burnt out, but it's another thing entirely to be struggling with full-on occupational burnout, which may last, months or even years after you leave the job which caused it. Now, the latter of which, that's what we're going to be talking about today. And after listening to these talks and getting a full view of the seriousness and the impact of occupational burnout, I hope that if you use the word burnt out, you think about the seriousness of that, but also think about kind of I'm feeling depressed versus I have depression, okay? They're different, but still, burnout is very serious. So my name is Dr. Rafael Boccamazzo. Everybody calls me Dr. B for long Italian name reasons. I'm a clinical psychologist in Washington State who's also the clinical director of the oldest mental health nonprofit in games, Take This. And sharing section, love it. And I talk about burnout a lot in our workshops. I'm here to define it, talk about its causes and its effects, so we're all on the same page before these three share their deeply personal stories and just really knock it out of the park and contextualize burnout for you all. Alicia Fortier is up next after me, and she's going to talk about her early career experiences as well as lessons learned in the process. Osama Dorias follows, and we'll talk about his experiences with the long-term effects of burnout as a senior-level employee. And Anna Brandberg is going to round this all out and talk about how to address burnout in a multimodal manner, only part of which involves self-care. And afterwards, we'll do some Q&A. As a reminder, please leave reviews. So we have more talks like this in the future. You'll get an email. Please leave those reviews. We want to see more conversations about this and from a lot of different voices. So before we get started with all of this, this talk is not going to be wine and roses. People are going to be sharing their deep personal experiences with some details. We're going to be frankly discussing medical topics, mental health topics, depressive symptoms, recovery processes. So if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling overwhelmed, please guard your own limits. Step out if you need to. We're not going to judge you badly. In fact, we're going to applaud you for taking care of yourself. So let's talk definitions. Research psychologist Dr. Christina Maslach's model of occupational burnout has been the most commonly and widely researched model since its inception in 1981, and it's the basis of the World Health Organization's inclusion of occupational burnout in the ICD-11. Now, by her model, occupational burnout is a chronic syndrome due to exposure to overwhelming long-term stress in the workplace, and it has 3 dimensions, all of which she argues are necessary for full-on burnout. Now, exhaustion is the one that everybody probably knows. Everybody probably talks about it with some gallows humor, but it's more than just being physically tired. You take a few days off and it goes away. We're talking about a kind of pervasive, bone-deep, soul-crushing cognitive and emotional weariness that paradoxically interferes with our ability to rest and recover. Now, ineffectiveness is the second dimension, and it's not just self-doubt or imposter syndrome. With burnout, our effectiveness is measurably decreased, and not once or twice. Our performance is consistently not as good over a long time. And the third dimension has different names depending on which research you might look at, cynicism or personal detachment. With that, we might see mood shifts like anger at yourself, other people around you. You might see cognitive shifts like a lack of investment. We might force ourselves to physically do the work, albeit badly, but we're mentally checked out, and again, over a long period of time. So basically, when it comes to burnout, we're exhausted and can't recover. We're detached, don't care, maybe even angry. We're working, but not effectively, and all of it is chronic, and we can't shake it. And it might extend outside of our work lives into our home lives, into our family lives, into our social lives. So a couple of caveats about this. There's other models of burnout. This is just the most commonly researched one, and a good chunk of burnout research is based on service industries like medicine and teaching. I actually don't know of any direct research in the game industry. Researchers call me. Not all research uses all three dimensions in its measurements. Some will only focus on things like exhaustion and cynicism or personal detachment. They may leave ineffectiveness out, or maybe one of three. And despite Maslach's model being validated across many countries, there are still some cultural differences in how distress is expressed, as we might expect. For example, a study of the Portuguese language version of the Maslach burnout inventory showed a lack of cross-cultural stability when looking at native Portuguese speakers in both Portugal and Brazil. And you're going to learn from Anna that the Swedish healthcare system conceptualizes burnout a little bit differently. But even with those differences, I think we can learn from their systemic approach to remedying it, especially given that the contributing factors in this model are systemic. So however you may think of burnout, if you find yourself chronically struggling with the effects of workplace-related stress, you can't shake it, and you don't know what to do, reach out to a qualified health professional in your area who specializes in working with workplace stress. Now, if we are looking at Maslach's model, research points to 6 factors which contribute to burnout through chronic mismatches between a person and their work environment. The first one's probably the most obvious, and that's workload. Specifically, if a person is given consistently more work than they can realistically do, that contributes to this. Think of cultures of overwork. We know of no one in the game industry who overworks, right? Think of scope creep, or think of increased responsibilities due to layoffs, job consolidation, anything that can add to this. Number 2 is reward, and this is a mismatch between what you put in and what you get out, and I don't just mean financial, though please pay people appropriately. I also mean intrinsic rewards, like recognition in a personally meaningful ways. Pizza parties don't cut it. Third is control, our perceived ability to affect how we work and what we work on. Are your tasks and work methods consistently dictated by a top-down approach, or do you have any input on things like your schedule, your work location? Do you feel empowered to not answer emails on the weekends and evenings? And fourth is community. This is where we get into the stuff not a lot of people think about. Fourth is community. Do people have a sense of belonging at work? Or are there divisions, subtle or overt, based on things like identity, disability status, job role or department, or even full-time employee versus contractor status? Anything that reduces belonging contributes to burnout. And the fifth is fairness. Are the policies, rules, and procedures, promotions, disciplinary measures applied equally to everyone, or are there certain people who seem to be disproportionately impacted? Are there people who work twice as hard for half the reward? Are there certain people in your company who are above reproach? And finally, values. Are the company's goals in alignment with your values as an employee, and is the company consistently enacting its stated values? Think of companies who overtly talk about putting employees first, but whose policies repeatedly prioritize productivity and profit over employee well-being. Now, there's overlap in each of these 6 factors, and by the way, this chart is available at takethis.org with a lot of other free information on burnout in case you're scrambling for notes. There's overlap on a lot of these factors, but I think it's safe to say that if you're consistently overworked, under-rewarded, have little control, don't feel like you belong, see unfairness in the workplace, and are working for a company that talks out of both sides of its mouth, you are going to burn out eventually. Now, I would also challenge each of you to look at any one of these factors and find even one of them where individual self-care fixes the problem. Most people cannot increase their own wages or change their workload without support from leadership. People generally can't self-care their way into feeling accepted and welcomed by others. People definitely can't self-care the company into being consistent with its values and its policies. Every factor here is driven by leadership, and so is the change which is needed at a systemic level to fight burnout. So when it comes to occupational burnout, focusing on individual resilience and self-care without changing the system is a bit like suggesting people just need to learn how to swim better in a leaky boat. Learning to swim is great, but we have to fix the boat. And in various studies, burnout or its individual dimensions have been linked to increased intention of turnover or turnover itself. It has been linked to long-term medical absences and just overall absenteeism and increased presenteeism. Each resignation of an employee can cost you 1/3 of their annual salary when you think of recruiting cost, productivity, retraining time, temporary hires, and burnt out employees talk. I really wanted to include the who's coming with me thing from Jerry Maguire. They are twice as likely to take other people with them. And I don't even have a figure on the reputation cost, because through the grapevine, you know which companies you don't want to work for. Burnt out employees talk. And regarding medical leave and absenteeism, one Finnish study noted that their male participants with burnout over a 2-year period had an average of 52 excess absences over a 2-year period. That is 5 weeks more per person per year. That's a lot of lost productivity. And if you don't know what presenteeism is, I bet most of us have done it at some point. You're at your office, you're staring at your computer, you're not doing anything. You're there physically, but that's about it. About 20 years ago, an estimation of presenteeism costs in the United States alone was $150 billion in lost productivity. And it's only increased in concerns from about 20 years ago. So fiscal costs notwithstanding, there's also the impact of your studio's ability to be innovative and creative, something I assume you would like to be in a creative industry. Maslach's burnout model also has notable conceptual overlaps with factors that affect creativity, which relies on people often feeling enough psychological safety and support to voice nascent ideas, which is extremely vulnerable. I mean, for anybody who's ever done that. People who don't feel a sense of inclusion or interpersonal support, as well as people who anticipate unfair treatment in the workplace, these are people who cannot give you their best work, nor are they likely to speak up if something isn't working on a project, which also costs you money in the long run. Think of extra patches, production delays, because no one felt safe enough to say anything. And what's more, they might not care anymore, and the work that they do give, even when they try, isn't quality work. So whether you want to look at burnout from a moral and human issue, and I hope you do, or you want to look at it from a perspective of cost and product, there's no shortage of reasons to take it seriously and address it. And because occupational burnout is causing the industry to lose so many talented and capable individuals who, under other circumstances, may have made a positive impact on your games and this industry. And now to illustrate some of those personal impacts, I'm going to hand it over to Alicia to talk about lessons from her early career.
Hi, I'm Alicia. This is my first time talking at GDC, so it's really exciting to see all of you. What I want to share today is let's unpack some trauma. I want to look at some of the pressures both we internalize and that exist in our general culture that push us to ignore our own limits and to ignore our own feelings, and maybe bring some nuance and some context to challenge ourselves and how it impacts our actions that we take. My talk is really going to be super relevant for people just breaking into the industry or who want to and who are juniors, and I love you and you're all in this room, I see you. And of course, anything that's basic continues to be useful even as you are established in your career, because we always need to be reminded of the foundations. And you know, it's tough out there. Take this, take what works for you, leave the rest. This is coming from my experience and my perspective. And as Dr. B said, I hope that we'll get more and more perspectives on this issue so that everyone finds something that helps. So who am I? Alicia Fuerte. I'm a lead game designer. Right now I work at Spryfox, which just got acquired by Netflix Games. It's actually really cool so far. And before that I worked 7 years in AAA. And I taught game design and game production in 5 years, which gave me a really interesting look into the psyche of our wonderful, ambitious next generation of game developers. And I relate, because that was me. I was a full-time student, I pulled all-nighters, I did game jams, I got high grades because I cared way too much. And I went into this industry eager, exuberant, and exhausted. I wanted to learn, I wanted to give, and I wanted to prove myself and my place here. And that meant that, I'm sure like some of you, I had no sense of self-preservation and how to guard myself. So let's contrast some of the pressure and some of the nuance that we can bring to those pressures. A, I need to prove myself constantly. Anything I don't know is a flaw. Well, the reality is I will learn with time, practice, and experience. The truth is there's infinite things to learn, right? And so we'll never learn them all at once. And what's important to learn to develop is evaluating when is enough for now. I hear my students all the time talk to me like as they're graduating, oh, I'm gonna do this thing and this thing and this thing and this thing and to be prepared, but you just graduated from something relevant. You have all your projects, you have your portfolio, we've already seen it. You are ready for your opportunity. And you're ready for now, and maybe just appreciate the time before you start being in school, and it'll be really hard to take vacation, go to a beach. And even in our careers, right? Be patient with yourself, give yourself grace with where you are now and what you still have to learn. Games are marathons, and we talk about this, right? Sprint after sprint to a milestone. And think of how much your energy you're expending at every part of that journey. If you're already burning on all cylinders at the beginning, what's going to be left at the end of that? And even if you manage to scrape it out and get to that game, what's left for the rest of your career? That's just one thing you've made. What's left of your creativity for the next game and the one after that? And have you even taken this time to take a step back and look at that horizon and see where you would like to go? I invite you to think critically about where you spend your energy. What are you learning, and how much extra effort do you have to learn just a little more? And to put in that extra effort, what are you sacrificing? Is it your sleep, your friends, your family? For how long will you sacrifice them? Our industry is a creative one, and it strives with iteration, right? We never get it right the first time. And we need to give ourselves time to be able to do multiple passes to learn from our mistakes. If each iteration is taken too far, well then there's going to be a big portion of that that's just going to kind of evaporate and not have been worth the time that you spent into it, right? And so you have to understand that everything you do is going to grow and grow and grow. And a trick that you have to learn, because it's not easy, we're always learning how to optimize this, but you want to focus on delivering what's essential to prove the goal of your current iteration. My trick of professionalism that I like to keep at heart is to identify the minimum necessary quality and learn to deliver it reliably. And that's not to say don't do good work. Minimum necessary quality does not mean bad, it means functional. Is this enough to represent my idea, to communicate with my team, to prove the basic idea that we had set out for this iteration? And then you're probably fine. And if you have extra ideas and things to explore, write them in a notepad. Do them later. This is a story about a cat. This is Sab. She was my childhood cat, and I loved her very much. One day in 2016, I was working on wireframes. I was in UX at the time, and for reasons lost to time, my wireframes were no good anymore because the feature I was working on completely pivoted. And I made the decision to stay late and to work on those wireframes to accommodate the new pivot. And that meant that I was missing a veterinary appointment to say goodbye to Sab. It wasn't until the lights were turning off on me in the building and I was walking out into the dark to wait for my Uber home that it occurred to me that I was never going to see my cat again, and that I had missed that chance to say goodbye to her. Days later, I went to visit my family. And who's walking around the house but Sab? It turns out that day was the day David Bowie died, and my brother decided that was too much death for a single day, and they had to reschedule the cat, but no one's thought to send me the memo. So I had already felt really, really guilty. And I was lucky in a way because I got my second chance to say goodbye to her and to learn from that mistake I made. But what I want to leave to you is that you don't always get a second chance. If work is being assigned to me, I should be able to complete it all as requested. Learning your limits, how to ask for help, and when to say no are all important skills. And I say skills because it doesn't come naturally to all of us, but when you practice it, it will get easier. The concept of buckling down and powering through, and especially doing so without saying that's what you're doing, can set the expectation that that's a normal amount of work to achieve. And I really want to highlight quietly because it's a creative industry. I would be such a hypocrite if I said never work hard for something you care about. But it's just acknowledge that you are doing an extra effort. And then talk to your manager, whoever's organizing your tasks, to make sure that they understand that. Because if you give everything, what's going to be left for the rest of your life that needs you? So the goal is to learn to advocate for yourself. And it will take practice, so practice it. But just as Dr. B said, you don't have full control. And this can be really hard to do if you don't have the support of the leadership around you. If you're in a position where you try to speak out and it's not well received, and you don't have support, and you don't have the tools, and you don't feel like you have options, those unreasonable deadlines and expectations, all I really want to say to you is that you're in that very difficult position, do not reflect your worth. Do not reflect how much you deserve to be here. Do not reflect your skill or your merit. It reflects the bad decisions of the leadership around you. The way to advance my career is by exceeding expectations every time. The nuance here is that each workplace has its own culture and criteria that I need to figure out. A question to ask yourself is the right place for me to grow? Do I have the connections? Do I have mentorship? Do I have people who are helping me navigate this strange and weird space? Do I have opportunities to grow in the ways I want to grow? Is the work I do meaningful and visible to the rest of the team? Am I getting credit for it? And do my values align with the values of the company I'm in? The answers to these questions can change as you grow within a company and as you grow in your seniority, and that's really healthy and natural. Pressure. Everyone else is fine. I'm overreacting, and I just need to work harder. Nuance. I need to listen to my own emotions, and they are valid and important. And when I speak to you, I'm really speaking to myself. Put aside how you think others are coping. I know for myself, I use it to deflect from how I'm feeling. But really, we can't know what other people have going on, and how they present themselves could be completely dissonant with what they have going inside. And so the question I want to ask is, how are you? And more than that, how are you really? Is there something scary? Is there something dark in a crux, in a little nook of yourself that you're afraid to question, and how it might unravel other parts of your life? I won't ask you to do that right away. It takes time, it takes courage, and hopefully professional help to unravel that, but at least acknowledge that it's there, and that is actually where you're at. If I don't finish this, I won't be a team player, and I will have failed. Nuance. I am allowed to leave. You do not owe it to anyone to grind yourself down into a nub of your creative self. Take a step back from deliverables and expectations and promises and deadlines and ask yourself the real hard question, is where I am helping or hurting me? We don't all have the chance to just drop our jobs as soon as it's not going well. But if you look at this frankly, you can start to think, I deserve better, I deserve another thing. Start to look on that horizon. Where can I go that might be better for me? We live and work in a vibrant, ambitious, and passionate industry. And personally, I love it. I love making games. And I put passionate in red because it can work for us and against us. It's a dangerous flame. And we give so much of ourselves into our work. And in fact, it's very hard not to care. So many times I found myself saying, I just don't care anymore. I was lying. I always cared. And I think that's beautiful and precious, and it needs to be protected. And so long as we're working in the systems that we're working, I hope that you all show yourself the same care that you put into your work. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm really happy to see so many of you here. It means you're taking this subject very seriously. I have to apologize. I lost my voice. It hurts to talk, but I'll do my best. So my name is Osama Dorius, and I'm a career game designer. Currently, I'm the lead content designer at Blizzard. I'm also a game design teacher at Dawson College, and I'm one of 3 Habibis on the Habibis podcast. We drink good Arab tea and talk about games and make fun of each other. It's a lot of fun. You should listen. These are some of the places I've worked in my 15 years in the industry. And these are some of the games that I've shipped. I've had the privilege of working on about 30 games across different platforms and genres. I love making games. I'm sharing my story because I hope that it can help people know what burnout can look like. I'm a little bit of a public person when it comes to the industry. And a lot of people didn't know that I burnt out until I came out on. I'm getting emotional already. Oh my God! Until I came out and told people, they thought everything was going great in my life, and it wasn't. And I thought it was extremely important for me to put that aside and to talk openly and freely because it's important. Hopefully, through my story, we'll be able to extract some signs so that you could all prevent the same thing from happening to you. But I know the reality. I've spoken to so many people. I would tell them, I had a burnout. And the answer is usually, so did I. But we just do it alone, quietly. Sorry, I didn't expect it to happen already. Thought I could at least get through 2/3 of the talk. So in 2019, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer. It was a very difficult time. As a result, I scaled back my work from 5 days a week, sometimes way more, to 4 days a week. The other 3 days I took care of my mom, and we took turns with my siblings. This was, of course, a very difficult time for her. And though I didn't admit it to myself at the time because I couldn't, it was a very difficult time for me and for my family. Thankfully, she went into remission right as the pandemic hit. As an extreme extrovert, I mean really off the charts extrovert, it was extremely difficult for me to stop all the things that gave me joy and energy. I was a teacher, I stopped that. I stopped going to the gym, I stopped organizing events, I stopped public speaking, I stopped all of that. Almost no social calls whatsoever. Really only when I felt like I was drowning did I go see friends. So I stopped everything that gave me joy and purpose in life. I panicked at the thought of going into a lockdown. I had just gone through one. At the time, we were living in a spacious 3-bedroom apartment. It felt spacious before the pandemic. Did not feel spacious afterwards. So it was more than enough for us then. This is a picture of me celebrating my birthday 2 weeks into the pandemic from my bedroom/office. With a very thin door, I could hear everything that happened outside. I had to work out of my bedroom, obviously, because we didn't have enough rooms to go around. But what people didn't know is I spent almost my entire day there. I mean, I'd wake up, roll over, start working, roll away maybe to have lunch, usually not. I'd eat at my desk in my room. And I'd finish work with maybe an hour or two that I spent outside watching a TV show or something, and then go back to the same room where I was working to sleep again. I developed insomnia as a result. I couldn't sleep. I'd walk into the room, and all I could think about is work. Some days I would be able to sleep 5 and 6 hours. I'd count myself lucky. Other days it was 1 or 2 or none, staring at my wall, trying not to look over at my computer. And I no longer got any joy from any of the activities that I used to get joy from before. I didn't enjoy playing video games. I didn't enjoy watching movies or, reading books or anything. All those felt like a chore. I need to disconnect from work. I gotta do something else. I gotta do this. And that felt like work too. And this put me into a depression. I started getting migraines, in intense bouts of fatigue and panic attacks that came out of nowhere. I reacted by cutting out what little I had picked up from when my mom recovered. At that point, I had started teaching remotely, and I was mentoring people pro bono, and I was speaking remotely, and I'm like, well, I gotta cut that out too. I gotta focus on work. I never thought ahead. It was always survive the day, survive the hour, survive the minute, survive this task, whatever I had to do. And every day got harder than the day before. I had less and less energy, cared less and less about anything, and couldn't focus. What was that beep?
Don't worry about it.
Don't worry about that.
So of course I forced myself to work even harder to compensate. Work was piling up. What do you do to solve that problem, right? You do more work. My entire life and every waking moment was spent thinking about work, the work I wasn't able to do. Not that I was doing a good job at work anyway. You spend more time and you accomplish less and you make more mistakes and you spend more time to fix them. And I have no confidence in anything at this point either. I felt so disconnected. People would ask me things that anyone in my position should know, and I would check the notes because I had no idea anymore. I started getting angry, and don't have to tell you, that was completely out of character for me. I'm not an angry person. I never was from my childhood. My anger really expressed itself usually as sadness. I wasn't the person who yelled or threw things. And all of a sudden, I would wake up angry for no reason. And I was really confused by this. Sorry. I would wake up and I would leave my family and go for long walks because I didn't want it to affect them. It took a couple of times where I was like, why am I yelling? No one did anything. It wasn't until I started preparing this talk that I even realized that this was connected to the burnout at all. I didn't understand it. It was an alien thing. I started talking to Dr. B, and he mentioned that anger and cynicism was a symptom of burnout, and that it started making all the sense. All of a sudden, I'm like, okay, this is all connected. But in the moment, you can't think about any of that. You don't understand it. And it started actually seeping into my work life. I am the eternal optimist. We can do this. I'm the cheerleader. Even when it's not good to be a cheerleader, I was working on that and trying not to be, but it's still, that was the natural way that I expressed myself. We could do it. We could accomplish it. This is good enough. Don't worry about it. Go to the next thing. I was the positive person, and I became not the positive person. Everything was destined to fail. Even when it was in the game, something's going to go wrong. I became the biggest cynist. It became harder and harder to wake up and start my workday. I took longer and longer breaks where I would just be present, but not really there. And eventually, I started taking days and weeks off at a time. Then one day, I was back to my old self again, full of energy. I was driven, I was happy. I did an impossible amount of work in 1 week, and I had whiplash from it. What is happening here? And then the next week, I couldn't get out of bed. I took that day off, and the one after, and the one after. And when I finally got the energy to just roll over to my computer, I spoke to my bosses, and I told them what was happening. And they forced me to talk to my doctor, who immediately put me on sick leave. It turns out that it's normal to get a burst of energy before collapsing. It's not unlike the thrashing throes of someone who's drowning before they get submerged and aren't able to move anymore. This is called having an over-engagement before having a disengagement. I started taking walks. And when I tell you it was painful to take walks, I wasn't moving. The entire day I was sitting. It was 5 minutes and I ran out of stamina and my knees hurt like crazy. It was so embarrassing. But I started taking walks. I saw a personal trainer and she helped me a lot. I saw a physiotherapist and that hurt a lot. but I started seeing a lot of progress. I started going to therapy, and that helped a lot. I started picking up hobbies. I started cooking for the fun of it. I started biking. I was prescribed a lot of pills, happy pills and panic and anxiety pills and sleeping pills and blood pressure pills and all the other things that were wrong with my body, and they helped me a lot. You don't know how bad things are until you feel them good again for just a little bit and you realize how helpful it is. I started looking for a house because obviously our space wasn't big enough. We really needed the room because my kids are kids, and even though they fought before, they really fought during the pandemic. It was extremely difficult, and her walls are really thin. When I was unmuted, my coworkers heard everything, which was frustrating and embarrassing for me. And we eventually did find a house, and we were able to have the room that we needed, and each of my kids had their own room. And I had, for the very first time in my life, my own office. And this helped with psychological disengagement. I was able to leave, and it took time, but I was able to stop thinking about work, which is the thing I wasn't able to do before. And now my kids had their own rooms, so they fought less. A normal amount, a pre-pandemic amount, which was good. But ultimately, I was unhappy. All these good things were happening, and I was happy for maybe 5 minutes at a time. But the reality is, I associated my self-worth to productivity, and I wasn't being productive. I was useless, and therefore I was worthless. And so I misrepresented my situation to the doctor, and I went back to work too early. It was the stupidest thing I've ever done. I went back to work, and I felt like my old self again for a week. And then I realized how much of a mistake I made. I stepped down as lead, and even with a reduced workload, I wasn't keeping up. Even with my team being understanding and loving, it didn't make a difference. My wife was with me throughout. She's a saint. She was extremely understanding and very helpful, and she was supportive, and I'm incredibly grateful to her. I started speaking to my industry friends, and that's when I was learning that so many people suffered in silence that I had no idea. One of the people I looked up to the most, one of the best narrative designers / directors to ever work in our industry, who'd been there forever, told me that when she had her burnout, she couldn't read a book for 6 months. This is a person who used to pick one up to drop it off to pick up the other one. She was a chain reader, and for 6 months, she could not pick up a book. And speaking to her, it gave me permission to just take a step back guilt-free. I also reconnected with industry friends, because the problem is at this point, most of my friends were industry friends, and they were supportive and they understood, but every time I got together, all we did was complain about the industry. So reconnecting with these old friends, I was able to also disengage. This also contributed to psychological disengagement. And we talked about boring things like mortgages and lawns. It was beautiful. I took time off to avoid getting sick leave again. I had about 3 months of vacation time that I didn't take, red flag, at the beginning of 2021, and I had 0 by the end of it. I was completely unable to do anything creative or to solve any problems at all at this point. Like, it was from bad to 0. I hit rock bottom. You give me a problem, I couldn't fix it. And so I was looking for a job outside of game design. And this caused an identity crisis, because up until this point, I was a game designer. What am I if I'm not? And so I found a job at Unity as a partner relations manager. I did that for 9 months. I still don't know what it is. They started telling me I was doing a good job. Months later, I actually believed them. And then my creativity came flooding back, and my energy came flooding back. Not to, the levels it was before, but to a point where they were actually measurable. And I realized that I started healing. I'm very grateful to that team because they gave me the support. I went into the interview telling them I'm burnt out, and they're like, welcome. It was beautiful. Very eternally grateful to them. And now I'm happy to say that after 9 months of hiatus, I'm back in a design role at Blizzard Entertainment. Super happy. I joined them in October last year. It's been just shy of 6 months. Same thing. I told them I went through a burnout, told them what happened, because you have to explain that gap in your, Evan's there. I interviewed with him and I told him the same thing. I told literally everyone I had to set expectations because I used to be an overachiever and now I'm just an achiever, right? So I'm trying to be kind to myself, but I still have relapses. I have days where I wake up and I can't do it. And thankfully now it's more like hours that I can't do it. It's getting better. And when my brain is firing on all cylinders, I'm the old Osama again. And I designed 3 things in one day, and I finished them, and they're great. So I still have whoever I was in me there somewhere. And I'm extremely grateful to everyone who helped me through the hardest parts. I love you all, and many of you are here. And I hope that my story helps people struggling with creative burnout to learn the warning signs and to know that we're not alone. I can't. Thank you.
So, before I begin, I have a lot to cover and very little time, so I am going to go through my slides pretty quickly. Don't stress about taking notes. There's a link to everything at the end of my slides, so eyeballs up here, please. Or there, rather. Okay, so I've done a bunch of stuff at a bunch of places, none of which I'm going to talk about here today, but happy to chat about it some other time, of course. I live in Sweden, which is one of 9 countries in the world where occupational burnout is an actual medical diagnosis. And it's called utmattningssyndrom. And I learned this the hard way. I moved across the world to Stockholm for a new job just before the pandemic broke out, and I quickly found myself isolated in a foreign city. Everything shut down around me, and work was all I had left, so I threw myself into it. At my worst, I'd become a shell of myself. I was constantly exhausted. I'd be running at 120% Monday to Friday, and then on weekends, I would literally not be able to get myself out of bed. And then I'd beat myself up for being so unproductive, and I would go back to pushing myself to extremes again. I was so stressed that I couldn't wind down at night or stop my brain from racing long enough to even attempt sleep. The anxiety and insomnia became so intense that I was prescribed sleeping tablets. I was having daily panic attacks and breakdowns. I'd be washing the dishes, and suddenly I would just disintegrate into a puddle of tears on the floor, sobbing until I couldn't breathe, and I didn't understand why. I'd forget about meals or be too stressed to eat, which resulted in a dramatically scary weight loss. I was getting weird nosebleeds and my hair started falling out, and it was when the brain fog took over that I got real scared. I'd have entire days where I would lose hours of my life. I'd finish meetings and I'd have literally no idea what was said. Not even me. I'd be mid-sentence and suddenly I would just lose the entirety of the English language. I realized I couldn't trust my brain at all. And anytime I allowed myself a little break, I would feel so guilty because there was so much work to do and I was so behind on everything. I was newly diagnosed with ADHD and I struggled with clinical perfectionism, so anything less than perfect felt like failure. And I didn't want anyone to think that I couldn't do my job. It got to the point where I actually asked people to stop asking if I was okay. Because every time they did, I would just start crying. And I didn't want to let them know that I was falling apart. Near the end of summer, when I started leaving my apartment again, I was in constant pain. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and the lack of exercise for almost 2 years meant that my muscles had atrophied so much that I actually couldn't walk more than 30 minutes at a time. Fun. I'd stopped doing all the things that I used to love doing. In fact, I didn't even want to do them. But I was keeping up the facade for everyone around me because I'd always been the person that others go to for help. I was the strong one. And I was so ashamed to admit that I was a fully grown adult that couldn't even seem to take care of myself. If all of these criteria feel familiar to you, you're probably not just being overly dramatic. I've got them listed in the document at the end so you can read through them properly. But the thing is, and this is important, you do not need to fill in all of these criteria. You don't need to match all of these before you speak to your workplace. You can and you should speak to your workplace before you get to that point. The earlier, the better, for everyone, I promise. But this whole time, I was telling people I was fine. Looking back at how I was communicating with my team, there were endless red flags about my mental state, and yet I was telling everyone that I was fine and I had it all under control. The first step was realizing that I was in fact not okay. I had to admit that I was drowning and I needed help. And I learned that help was available as soon as I asked for it. I booked a doctor's appointment, and she first did a verbal assessment, and then we did a physical examination and a blood test to rule out the possibility of there being something else causing the symptoms. And then I was sent on to stress rehab. Yeah, that's a thing in Sweden. And I'm super privileged to be living in a country where we have public healthcare, which meant that stress rehab, doctor's appointments, everything I needed was free. I was also assigned a caseworker from Sweden's social insurance agency who had meetings with my company to ensure that my workload and my responsibilities were adjusted to enable my recovery in a sustainable way. And this was super important because I wanted to be the best rehabber ever, and I wanted to get back to work as soon as possible. They were all very adamant, however, that I calm down and take it slow. All research has shown that returning back to work full-time too quickly is actually directly counterproductive. It is harmful. Because the fact of the matter is, there are no awards for being a good burnouter. Sorry. So, some of the stuff that I learned at stress rehab. Well, burnout happens in 4 phases. First up, we have the build-up phase, which can last for several years with fluctuating symptoms. Then we have the acute onset phase, which involves more severe exhaustion and escalating symptoms. And then comes the crisis phase, which has debilitating symptoms, both cognitive and physical, and it usually subsides within a few weeks, which leads us to the recovery phase, hopefully. This can last for many years, with lingering symptoms and a pronounced stress intolerance. This is something that I am still struggling with today, several years later. I can no longer handle the amounts of stress that I used to. I fall apart way faster than I used to, and it's so frustrating because you're just like, I should be able to handle this, and I can't. But all right, let's map those onto a curve. So in the build-up phase, we have more activity than recovery, which leads to us compensating. The symptoms start to worsen until we crash. And it's at this point that we realize that we can't keep going like this anymore, and we're forced to stop battling and start allowing ourselves recovery time. And naturally, it's not a straight upwards curve. Setbacks will happen, and it's important to be aware of them and be aware that from the get-go that they're going to happen, accept them as part of the recovery process, and instead analyze what caused them and what their effects were. And I want you to understand that this doesn't happen overnight. For me, it took over 9 months to get back to working full-time again. The doctor wanted to put me on 100% sick leave straight away, but I refused, because of course I did. I insisted on still working part-time for 2 months until I realized I couldn't do it anymore. And after that, I was completely out of commission for 2 months before coming back to working 25% while I attended stress rehab on the side. And then we carefully increased my workload to 50% again before coming back to 100. But I wish that I had listened. I wish I had taken time off straight away. Perhaps I would have avoided the crisis phase altogether. And I wish I would have allowed myself a gentler return to work. But what do you do if you're already experiencing or approaching burnout? First and foremost, remember, burnout is a systemic failing, not an individual one. It is your workplace that has failed you, not the other way around. That said, if you're currently in the thick of it, here's some things you can do to keep yourself from drowning. First up, chat to the person responsible for your work and ask them to help you put a recovery plan together. Ideally, the very first thing on your plan should be to take some time off. I know this may sound shocking to the Americans in the audience, but the vast majority of countries are entitled to more than 10 days of vacation per year. Yes, even poor ones. In fact, research has shown that we need a minimum of 2 weeks away from work for the brain to stop thinking about work. That means not just a few days, you need a proper long period with adequate time for your brain to detach from stressful work thoughts. And then, when you return to the workplace, remember that it's your workplace that is responsible of ensuring that your workload and responsibilities are adjusted going forward to ensure that you don't just fall straight back into crisis mode. It's not on you to adjust to your workplace. It's on your workplace to adjust to you. And if your workplace isn't willing to help you with a recovery plan, consider whether you should even stay in your current job or not. And I'm aware that this is said from a position of privilege, but is your job worth risking your entire health for? And for all the managers in the room, do your employees actually have options, or are they stuck there as is? It's much faster and easier to help a current employee recover than trying to find, hire, and train up an entirely new employee. So getting into a little stress rehab theory, there are various forms of therapy that are proven to help with burnout recovery. Many of you may be familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, and I don't have time to go into the details, but for us at Stress Rehab, they're focused heavily on ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, and lots of mindfulness, which is not the same as meditation. Meditation expects you to empty your mind. Mindfulness expects you to fill it. You're asked to become aware of everything happening in your body as well as in your mind. I suddenly became aware of the amount of pain and stress that I was constantly holding in my body. By the way, this is your reminder to unclench your jaw. But I'd normalized feeling like this to the point where it had just become white noise to my brain. And I also became aware of my thoughts. I realized that I was constantly criticizing myself, constantly beating myself up, and I realized I need to treat myself the way that I treat others. Something that we kept coming back to is the 3 circles of emotional regulation, your different modes in your brain. So we have the drive system, which is dopamine-driven, and the purpose is to motivate you and help you accomplish goals. And then we have the soothing system, which is oxytocin-driven, and the purpose of that is to manage distress, make you feel safe, bond with others. And the last one is the threat system, which is adrenaline and cortisol-driven. You may know this as the fight or flight mode. The purpose is to detect threats, to protect you, to keep you alive. And all 3 of these are equally important for human survival, but they have to be in balance. The problem arises when they go out of balance, because as you might know, the fight or flight mode deactivates the other 2. The problem happens when all those things that you used to love doing, all those things that used to be, I want to do this, I want to do these things, they turn into an endless guilt-driven list of things that I have to and I should. But then how do we recharge? People aren't just batteries that you can plug in and leave alone until they've magically become fully charged again. You can't just plug yourself into the couch and watch Netflix for 2 weeks and expect that to fix everything. Sorry. It's important to find a balance in our activities where things that restore our energy are greater than those that cost energy. So how do I identify these things? How do I identify which modes our time is being spent on? They taught us this by making us fill in this activity tracker. I've also linked this in the document. We printed this out on a A4 page and did a 24-hour log and filled it in hour by hour as we go. What do you do? Monitor it for a full week. I thought this was going to be tedious. It takes no time. And at the end of the week, we came back and we had to identify what activities were blue, green, or red for us, and then take a moment to reflect on the result. I highlighted each section with its corresponding color and realized, oh my God, it was so confronting to be met with a wall of red. And I realized my week is not balanced, and I needed to adjust it. But recovery time doesn't just appear out of thin air. You have to explicitly make time for it. We were firmly told by our rehab psychiatrist that our free time was only allowed to be used for green activities. So look critically at everything that you feel like you need to do. That thing that's stressing you out, do you actually need to do it? Do you actually need to do it perfectly? Revisit your expectations, but also what things can be outsourced. Set your life up to reduce activation energy where possible. I'll link to examples in the document as well. And identify your support network. What people do you have around you, both in and outside of work, that can support you through this? Even just having someone to vent to and get things off your chest can be super, super helpful. And you'd be surprised at how many people would be more than happy to help offload simple things for you. And I swear you're not being an inconvenience for them. Often people want to do things to help you become less stressed. Write down 2 or 3 people that can drag you out kicking and screaming on your stupid little walks for your stupid little mental health. I actually asked my friends to do this. I told them, I'm gonna need to be walked like a dog. And you bet they did. They showed up at my door and they called and they said, Anna, put your shoes on, I'm outside, we're going walking. And I was so grumpy, and it was great. Within 10 minutes, I was like, oh wow, this is actually real helpful. But it's also good for accountability, because Lord knows if anyone is bad at respecting my boundaries, it's me. So after all this, what happened to my job? I was so worried that my burnout would be used against me somehow, but instead, they promoted me. Turns out prioritizing your health pays off in more ways than one. So things I'm trying to be mindful of going forward. This is my new mantra. My colleague wrote this and put this on my desk. She's amazing. Half-ass it. It's similar to a challenge that I got from my psych. She asked me to be mediocre for a week, and I was very offended. Mediocre is a 4-letter word for me, and I was like, I can't do that. I've got professional integrity. And she said, okay, well, what do you need to do in order to accomplish this? And I said, I need to tell everyone on my team that I've been told that I explicitly have to deliver mediocre work so that they know. And she was like, that's fine, do that then. I was like, okay, cool. So I did that. Came back a week later, and she was like, how did it go? And I was like, it was fine. It was fine. No one noticed, no one cared. And I hate it when other people are right. Another thing I'm trying to do is to neutralize my inner critic. My brain is a jerk, and I'm learning to listen to it less. And I do this by asking for regular feedback. I ask my team and my manager for regular feedback, because often they don't think that you're doing as badly as you yourself think that you're doing. And no one is as critical of you as you are. Everyone is focused on themselves. People don't notice the things that you notice. Something else that I'm trying to do is learning different ways to say no, because saying no is hard. And so I'm finding better responses. Things like, yeah, I'd be happy to help, but then you have to decide which of my other tasks get deprioritized. And to no surprises to anyone, very few of your other tasks will get deprioritized. But recovery is never linear. The goal is simply to gradually have longer, better good periods and shorter, less severe bad periods. Instead of focusing on what happened, focus on why it happened. Our stress rehab psychs were constantly reminding us to turn self-criticism into curiosity. Listen to your body, take things slow. I'm still in burnout recovery, 2 years later. Recovery generally takes years, but you can make huge changes within just a few weeks. And a gentle but firm reminder, nobody's expected to do all the things that we've spoken about. Even if you only manage to implement one thing, that's a huge step forward, and I'm proud of you. Overworking is a very fast way to have a very short career. There seems to be this thing among game devs nowadays where we brag about how badly we destroyed ourselves for certain projects, as if that grants us some form of credibility. But honestly, burning out sucks. There is nothing cool about pushing your health to such extremes. And don't forget to maintain perspective. We work in video games. It's easy to forget, but nobody will actually die if your video game is slightly worse than it could have been in a perfect world. No game, company, or project is worth your health. Remember this guy? Everyone knows this frame, but not everyone knows that this is actually how that comic continues. If things are on fire, then things are probably not fine. And most of the time, there actually isn't a reason to let things last that long and get that bad. Thanks. There's the link. If there is a slide that you should take a picture of, it's that one.
And yeah, we thought we were going to have time for questions, but we are at time right now. We are going to be available for a couple minutes over in the overhang area. So if you want to talk with us, ask questions, we will be hanging out there briefly, but please remember to fill out your feedback forms. Thank you for being here. Please don't burn out.